So for this service, I'd like to share on the topic, he was moved with compassion for them.
喺今日嘅聚會就想以就憐憫他們作為一個主題。
So originally I was thinking of titling this sermon, Feeding the 5,000. So originally I was thinking of titling this sermon, Feeding the 5,000.
本身我諗住嘅主題係餵養5000人。
Because this title that I do have is a quote from the story of that miracle.
咁因為呢一句説，其實我而家嘅主題亦都係呢一個神蹟入邊嘅一句説話。
That miracle is of course recorded in the Gospel books in the New Testament.
咁呢一個就係喺呢一個新約嘅入邊去記載嘅一個神蹟。
It's perhaps one of Jesus' most well-known miracles.
可能係一個我哋最多人認識嘅神蹟。
So if you went to RA classes when you were young,
咁如果你喺細個嘅時候有去參加宗教教育課堂，
I'm sure you've probably had to draw or colour in a picture of those 5 loaves and 2 fish.
咁我諗你哋都有油過顏色或者畫畫，就係畫呢個5餅2魚。
So though I'm sure many people are familiar with this story,
我亦都好相信好多人都係非常之熟悉呢個故事。
we're going to first turn to it in the Bible and make sure that everyone is familiar with it.
咁你首先咧就要打開聖經去確保大家都係認識嘅。
Okay, so let's start by turning to the book of Mark, chapter 6.
我哋首先打開馬可福音嘅第6章。
Let's read verse 33 to verse 36.
我哋去讀31節到36節。
So it's the book of Mark, chapter 6,
馬可福音第6章
verse 33 to verse 36.
33到36節。
Okay, verse 33. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat."
33節，眾人看見他們去，有許多認識他們的，就從各城步行，一同跑到那裏，比他們先趕到了。耶穌出來見有許多的人，就憐憫他們，因為他們如同羊沒有牧人一樣。於是開口教訓他們許多道理。天已經晚了，門徒進前來說：這是野地，天已經夜了，就請叫眾人散去，他們好往四面鄉村裏去，自己買什麼吃。
So see here at the beginning that Jesus and the disciples had departed out of the city into the wilderness.
咁呢一個開始嘅時候係耶穌同埋門徒去離開呢個城市嚟到野地。
But some people had seen them leaving.
咁有啲人就見到佢哋離開。
So word spread and many people came from different cities and towns to gather and even to wait for Jesus.
咁其實係佢哋係由唔同嘅城市嚟到，佢哋去聚集等待耶穌。
So Jesus and his disciples end up spending time with this multitude of people for the whole day and into the late evening.
咁耶穌最後同門徒就同呢一啲百姓一齊一個全日去到好夜。
So here at this late time, the disciples make what seemed to be a very sensible suggestion.
咁去到夜晚啦，咁門徒其實佢哋嘅建議係好似非常之合理。
That they should go send the crowds away so that they are able to each find food for themselves.
就係叫佢哋散去，佢哋可以自己去買嘢食。
Okay, let's continue to read verse 37 to 38.
咁我哋繼續睇37到38節。
Verse 37, but he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish.
37節，耶穌回答說：你們給他們吃吧。門徒說：我們可以去買20兩銀子的餅給他們吃嗎？耶穌說：你們有多少餅可以去看看。他們知道了，就說5個餅2條魚。
So Jesus makes a seemingly ridiculous request to his disciples.
咁耶穌喺呢一個就好似作出一個唔合理嘅建議，
telling them to give to provide the food for all these people.
就叫門徒去俾嘢佢哋食。
So one of my favorite questions to ask students, like RE students, about the story is how many people did they end up feeding?
咁我有一個好中意問我啲學生嘅一個問題就係：咁佢哋最後係為咗幾多人呢？
Because despite this miracle being called feeding the 5,000,
咁雖然呢個神蹟係叫做給5000人吃飽，
the Bible states that it was actually 5,000 men.
咁其實聖經入邊佢講5000人其實係男人，
with additional women and children.
咁其實係仲有呢一個女人同埋小朋友。
So in the UK, I believe we have less than 3,000 members in the whole of the UK churches.
咁我覺得喺英國全部教會入邊，其實應該係少過3000個信徒。
So if we gathered all UK members in one place and then doubled them,
咁如果我哋將所有英國嘅信徒去聚集一齊，亦都係將呢一個數去乘以，
well, we'd probably still have less people than the number of the people that the disciples had to go and feed.
咁呢個總數咧，其實可能係少過佢哋喺呢個神蹟入邊去餵飽嘅人數。
Or we can imagine if we had all these members, even if we didn't double them, we just had all of the UK members gathered together.
咁如果我哋冇將英國嘅信徒乘以，只係將所有嘅信徒聚集喺一齊，
Or we can imagine the complexity of just trying to feed those almost 3,000 members.
咁我哋都可以諗啦，要去餵飽呢3000人係幾咁複雜。
Let's continue to read verse 39 to 44.
咁我哋繼續去睇39到44節。
Verse 39. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men.
39節，耶穌吩咐他們，叫眾人一幫一幫地坐在青草地上。眾人就一排一排地坐下，有100一排的，有50一排的。耶穌拿着這5個餅2條魚，望着天祝福，擘開餅，遞給門徒，擺在眾人面前，也把那2條魚分給眾人。他們都吃並且吃飽，門徒就把碎餅碎魚收拾起來，裝滿了12個籃子。吃餅的男人共有5000。
So Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish that they were able to find.
咁耶穌就攞咗佢哋揾到嘅5個餅2條魚，
He then blessed it.
佢祝福，
And with it, the disciples were able to feed those more than 5,000 people.
咁佢哋就可以去餵飽多過5000人，
And even ended up with 12 baskets full of leftovers.
咁甚至係有呢個12籃子嘅剩餘。
So it's indeed a great miracle that Jesus was able to perform.
呢個係一個非常之大耶穌去做嘅神蹟。
But why did Jesus not send the multitude away?
咁點解耶穌佢冇叫佢哋去離開呢？
Or why did he not send them away earlier when they had more time to go and look for food?
或者係當時間更加早，佢哋有機會去揾到嘢食嘅時候，就已經叫佢哋離開呢？
So was it so that he would have this opportunity to perform this great miracle?
係咪因為為咗有呢個機會去行呢個神蹟？
Note that there were so many people still there into the late evening.
咁其實咁多人仍然留到去夜晚，
It means that for all these people, that even if they were tired or hungry,
雖然佢哋係好攰、好肚餓，
that they still desperately desired to be together with Jesus.
但係佢哋仍然係非常迫切想同耶穌一齊，
Whether it was, for example, to seek his help for healing
可能係想求佢去醫治，
or to listen to his teachings.
或者係去聽佢嘅教訓。
That these people desired Jesus greater than any suffering that they were going through.
咁佢哋係非常之渴望有耶穌，係甚至比佢哋呢啲成日痛苦係更加渴望。
So for Jesus, seeing that these people needed him so much,
咁耶穌就見到呢一啲人咁需要佢，
Jesus could not just send them all away.
咁耶穌就唔忍心將佢哋就咁叫走，
So he gave his time to be with all this multitude,
佢就俾呢一啲時間去呢一個會中，
spending a whole day all the way into the late evening.
一整日去同佢哋一齊，甚至去到夜晚。
If we look back again at the beginning,
如果你再睇翻去開頭，
we see that this is also the reason for why the whole situation occurred in the first place.
咁亦都係點解成件事會發生，
That Jesus had compassion on the people.
就係耶穌憐憫佢哋。
Let's go back and read verse 34.
我哋去睇翻34節，
Verse 34.
34節。
And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things.
34節，耶穌出來見有許多的人，就憐憫他們，因為他們如同羊沒有牧羊一般。於是開口教訓他們許多道理。
So this was not the plan of Jesus.
呢個唔係耶穌嘅計劃。
Jesus and the disciples wanted to find some solitude.
咁其實耶穌同埋佢哋想去門徒，佢哋想去揾安靜。
Yeah. But when they arrived, they saw all these people in need.
咁但係當佢哋到咗嘅時候，佢哋就見到所有需要嘅人。
So even from the very beginning, he did not have the heart to turn them all away.
咁佢就喺一開頭已經唔想去離開佢哋，
Or, for example, to tell them that, that this is now our time where we need to rest.
咁冇話俾佢哋知其實我哋而家需要休息啦。
So immediately accepted the crowd and began to both teach them and to heal the sick.
但係反而嘅佢係去開始去講話，去教訓佢哋，醫治佢哋。
Let's turn to Psalms chapter 145.
我哋去打開詩篇145篇，
Verse 8 to verse 9.
第8到第9節。
Psalms 145,
詩篇145篇，
verse 8 to verse 9.
第8到第9節。
Okay, verse 8.
第8節。
The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger and great in mercy. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works.
第8節，耶和華有恩惠有憐憫，不輕易發怒，大有慈愛。耶和華善待萬民，他的慈悲覆庇他一切所做的。
So some Christians, and I'm not saying in Jesus' church, but they try to contrast the loving and merciful nature of Jesus that we see in the New Testament with the seemingly fierce and wrathful God that we see in the Old Testament.
咁有啲基督徒，但唔係講緊真耶穌教會嘅基督徒，佢哋就去比較耶穌神嘅慈愛喺呢個舊約同埋神嘅憤怒。
But we see that even in the Old Testament, that the psalmists, like this example here, recognize the compassion and mercy of God.
咁即使喺舊約喺詩篇入邊，其實詩人都去承認耶和華嘅慈愛憐憫。
Of God's tendency and his desire to do good works for his people.
神係想去對佢嘅百姓好。
Jesus is of course God himself.
咁耶穌當然係神啦。
And therefore is not different from the Old Testament God.
咁所以其實佢同佢舊約嘅神係冇分別。
And so Jesus' life demonstrates that same compassion and mercy that is inherent in God's nature.
咁耶穌去展示嘅慈愛，其實就係講緊神本身。
But the dictionary explanation of compassion is to have sympathetic pity and concern for suffering and misfortune of others.
咁呢個憐憫就係講緊佢去體恤人哋嘅受苦，去體恤人哋嘅軟弱。
So firstly, we need to, of course, observe and notice that someone is in suffering or in need.
咁當然我哋首先要去發現有啲人係受緊苦，佢哋係有需要幫忙。
Then to have feelings of sympathy and concern for that person.
咁我哋就要去憐憫，去同情嗰個人，
To care about their welfare.
去關心佢哋。
If we think about God,
我哋去諗起神，
then we may wonder, how is God able to really sympathize with our struggles?
咁其實神點樣去與我哋去共情嚟同情我哋呢？
God is very obviously different from us,
咁神其實係同我哋好唔同，
in many different ways.
喺唔同嘅方面同我哋好唔同。
He's an everlasting almighty spirit.
佢係永遠長存嘅靈，
He does not age or suffer illnesses.
佢唔會老或者係有生病。
He does not, for example, ever suffer through financial hardships.
咁佢唔會話有呢一個經濟嘅問題。
Similarly for us, it can feel difficult to sympathize over things that we have not perhaps personally experienced.
咁有陣時，如果我哋係冇經歷過一啲嘅事情嘅時候，其實我哋可能唔明白。
Now, how well can we really sympathize and understand someone who is suffering with cancer?
我哋點樣可以去明白一個人佢哋如果係有癌症，佢哋嘅感受呢？
Or, for example, someone who is living in desperate poverty.
或者有人係好窮嘅時候，我哋又點樣去明白呢？
If we have not experienced those things ourselves.
如果我哋自己係冇經歷過，
Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 4.
我哋去打開希伯來書嘅第4章。
So Hebrews chapter 4,
希伯來書第4章
verse 15 to verse 16.
第15到16節。
So it's Hebrews chapter 4,
希伯來書第4章
verse 15 to verse 16.
15到16節。
Okay, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
第15節，因我們的大祭司並非不能體恤我們的軟弱，他也曾凡事受過試探，與我們一樣，只是他沒有犯罪，所以我們只管坦然無懼地來到施恩的寶座前，為要得憐恤，蒙恩惠作隨時的幫助。
So the Bible also tells us that God is an all-knowing, omniscient God,
咁其實聖經都話俾你知，神係一切都知道嘅。
which should also then mean that God therefore must also know everything about us.
咁其實神係知道我哋所有嘅事，
That he does know the sufferings that we have.
佢都去明白我哋所受嘅苦。
So even though God knows already,
雖然神已經知道，
we see that God actually goes a step further.
咁但係神係行前一步。
So in verse 15 here,
喺15節呢度講，
the high priest that is mentioned is talking about Jesus himself.
咁呢度有講嘅大祭司其實就係講緊耶穌。
It says that Jesus, as the high priest, is able to sympathize with our weaknesses.
咁其實就係講緊耶穌作為大祭司，佢係可以體恤我哋嘅軟弱。
So why is that? Why is Jesus able to sympathize with us?
點解耶穌可以體恤我哋嘅軟弱呢？
Because Jesus was born on earth as a human,
因為耶穌係作為人子出生，
not fully human.
咁係一個人。
So this is not the same as when, for example, when God went to visit Abraham.
咁其實就同神去見呢個亞伯拉罕唔同，
And temporarily took on a human form.
咁就係暫時作為一個人嘅樣式。
Jesus came to earth, was born a baby, same as all of us.
咁耶穌係降生喺呢個世界上係真係由嬰兒出世，就好似我哋一樣。
So as a human, Jesus endured the same sufferings and temptations that we all endure as humans.
咁耶穌作為一個人，就係有凡事經過試探，就好似我哋作為人一樣。
So not only does God know because he is all-knowing,
咁唔係因為淨係神，因為知道所有嘢，所以佢就明白。
but he has also experienced things like tiredness, pain, rejection.
而佢自己係真係有經歷過呢一個攰，呢一個俾人拒絕。
But still, how does this apply to us?
咁對於我哋今日嚟講，有咩嘢學到呢？
Let's continue to read chapter 5,
我哋繼續去睇第5章
verse 1 to verse 3.
第1到第3節。
Verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required as for the people, so also for himself to offer sacrifices for sin.
第1節，凡從人間挑選的大祭司，是奉派替人辦理屬神的事，為要獻上禮物和贖罪祭。他能體恤那愚蒙和失迷的人，因為他自己也是被軟弱所困，故此他理當為百姓和自己獻祭贖罪。
So here it describes the human high priest.
咁呢度就講到人間嘅大祭司。
So in other words, those starting from Moses' brother Aaron and all of his descendants.
咁就係講緊呢一個摩西嘅哥哥亞倫同埋佢嘅子孫。
So why were they chosen to be the high priests?
點解佢哋係被揀選成為大祭司呢？
To be those ones who were the only ones able to offer these sacrifices for sin to God.
就係呢一個只係佢哋可以為人嘅罪去獻祭。
So see here in verse 2,
我哋喺度睇第2節，
it's not because they are special, that they are better than everyone else,
唔係因為佢哋係好特別，佢哋比更加其他人好，
that they are more holy or less resistant to sin than others,
或者係佢哋更加聖潔，佢哋係比較唔會容易犯罪，
but that they were able to fulfill the role of the high priest
但係佢哋能夠去做祭司嘅呢一個角色，
precisely because they are also human, just like the rest of all of us.
就係因為佢哋同我哋一樣都係一個人類，
That they also face the same sufferings, weaknesses, and temptations that we all face.
佢哋都有經歷同樣嘅軟弱，經歷同樣嘅引誘。
So this is instructive for us.
呢個就係話俾我哋知，
So we may not have experienced the exact difficulty, the exact same difficulty that someone else is facing.
我哋可能唔會經歷同人哋一模一樣嘅痛苦，
But we are all human and we do all have weaknesses.
但係我哋都作為人類，我哋都有軟弱，
We have all faced suffering in some form or other.
我哋喺唔同嘅方面都會有受過苦。
We may not have had cancer, for example, but we've experienced being ill, even if it was just having a cold.
咁我哋可能未必有生癌症，但係其實我哋都有生病過，可能就係感冒，
Like I've not had the experience of being a lost sheep, of not coming to church.
或者係我冇一個經歷，就係我係一個迷羊，我冇嚟到教會，
But I have experienced where my faith was weak,
但係我有一個經歷，就係我嘅信仰係軟弱，
or when I felt very distant from God.
或者係我覺得我同神嘅距離好遠。
So when we see the weaknesses of others,
如果你見到別人嘅軟弱，
we can think back to our own weaknesses and struggles.
咁我哋就諗翻起我哋自己嘅軟弱，我哋嘅受苦。
And from those experiences to have sympathy and compassion on others.
咁喺呢一啲經歷上邊，我哋就可以去體恤人，
And to understand why Jesus did not turn away all those people in need.
我哋就去明白到耶穌點解唔轉離開嗰啲需要嘅人。
So now to turn to understanding the mindset behind Jesus'
咁我哋
compassion.
而家就明白到耶穌佢嘅憐恤嘅背後嘅心態。
So the different gospel books which all record this miracle.
咁喺唔同嘅福音書入邊，其實都有記載呢一個神蹟。
There's two reasons for why Jesus and the disciples wanted to depart into the wilderness.
咁呢一個其實有兩個原因，點解耶穌同埋門徒想去到曠野？
So let's first turn back to Mark chapter 6.
我哋首先去打翻開馬可福音嘅第6章，
And let's read verse 30 to verse 32.
我哋去睇30到32節。
So that's Mark chapter 6,
馬可福音第6章
verse 30 to verse 32.
30到32節。
Verse 30. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves.
30節，使徒聚集到耶穌那裏，將一切所做的事、所傳的道全告訴他。他就說：你們來同我暗暗地到曠野地方去歇一歇。這是因為來往的人多，他們連吃飯也沒有功夫，他們就坐船暗暗地往曠野地方去。
So before the feeding of the 5,000,
咁去餵飽5000人之前，
and also recorded earlier in the same chapter,
咁其實喺呢一章嘅前面有記載，
Jesus had sent the disciples out in twos to go out to preach and to help others.
咁耶穌就派門徒兩個咁樣去傳福音。
So this was the sending out of the 70.
咁呢個就係去派門徒去傳福音。
So at this point here, the disciples have returned from all their individual ministry journeys.
咁佢哋就呢度係門徒，佢哋已經傳福音完啦，佢哋就翻到嚟。
Jesus recognized that after all their traveling and their labors that they had done, that they now needed some rest.
咁耶穌都知道佢哋經歷咗好多嘅交通啊，好多嘅路途，佢哋係需要休息。
In verse 31, it says that it was so busy in the city that they could not even find the time to eat properly.
喺31節其實係有講到佢哋甚至連食飯嘅功夫都冇。
So we can understand that they must have been both tired and hungry at this point.
咁我哋可以明白到喺呢一個時候，其實佢哋一定係非常之攰同非常之肚餓。
Also, which also means by the late evening,
咁其實去到咁夜，
it is not only the multitudes, but also Jesus and his disciples must have also been tired and hungry.
咁其實唔單止係會眾係非常之肚餓，其實佢嘅門徒同埋耶穌都係非常之肚餓同埋攰。
Let's also now turn to Matthew chapter 14.
我哋都打開馬太福音嘅14章，
And let's read verse 12 and verse 13.
去睇12到13節。
It's Matthew chapter 14,
馬太福音14章
verse 12 to 13.
12到13節。
Okay, verse 12.
12節。
Then the disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities.
12節，約翰的門徒來把屍首領去埋葬了，就去告訴耶穌。耶穌聽見了，就上船，從那裏獨自退到曠野地裏去。眾人聽見，就從各城裏步行跟隨他。
So this is the beginning of Matthew's recording of the same miracle of feeding the 5,000.
咁呢個就係馬太福音去記載同樣嘅一個神蹟嘅開頭。
In verse 12, the one who is mentioned as being buried was John the Baptist.
咁12節講到去被埋葬嘅就係施洗約翰。
So if you read earlier, you will see that he had been beheaded by King Herod.
咁如果我哋去睇翻前邊嘅時候，我哋就會見到係因為佢俾希律王斬頭。
So we see here in verse 12 that after his disciples had buried him, that they went to find Jesus
咁我哋就見到喺約翰嘅門徒埋葬佢之後，佢哋就話俾耶穌知，
and to tell Jesus of this sad news.
咁就話俾耶穌知呢一個傷心嘅消息。
And then so we see in verse 13 that after hearing this news, that Jesus wanted to go out to be by himself.
咁喺13節，我哋就見到當耶穌聽到呢個消息之後，佢係想獨自退到野地去。
Okay, let's continue to read verse 20 to verse 23.
我哋繼續去睇20到23節。
Okay, verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there.
22節，耶穌隨即催門徒上船，先到那邊去，等他叫眾人散開。散了眾人以後，他就獨自上山去禱告。到了晚上，只有他一人在那裏。
So after the multitudes were all fed, we see that then Jesus sends them all away.
咁我哋見到當佢哋都餵飽之後啦，咁耶穌就叫佢哋散去。
And he even sends his disciples away to travel ahead of him.
咁佢甚至叫到門徒係去先上船去先離開。
So that Jesus is now alone.
咁耶穌終於可以自己一個。
And then we see that Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray by himself.
咁我哋見到耶穌係獨自上山禱告。
Also from this, I think we can deduce that Jesus' purpose originally was actually to also go be alone so that he could mourn for John the Baptist.
咁我哋其實喺度可以推測，其實本身耶穌係諗住自己去禱告，可以去紀念呢一個施洗約翰。
And perhaps also to pray for strength.
亦都係去求呢個力量。
So we see that Jesus and his disciples weren't just trying to escape the crowds.
咁我哋可以見到，其實耶穌同埋門徒佢哋唔係話想去逃離呢一個百姓。
No, they had good reasons to want to find some quiet alone time.
但其實佢哋係有一個好嘅原因，佢哋想去安靜一下。
But again, when Jesus saw the multitude, he had compassion for them.
但係當耶穌見到呢啲百姓嘅時候，佢就憐憫佢哋。
His compassion for them meant that Jesus and his disciples put aside their own needs to first help the multitude.
因為佢嘅憐憫，所以耶穌同埋門徒就將佢哋嘅需要擺低，而係去照顧呢一啲百姓。
So if we want to learn and emulate this love and compassion of Jesus, we can set, I think, 2 stages or like goals.
咁我哋就可以，如果我哋想學習耶穌嘅呢一個憐憫，我哋就可以擺低自己嘅需要。
We can set 2 like stages or goals to improve. We can set 2 like stages to help ourselves improve.
我哋可以去有2個階段去幫助自己去改變。
Let's first turn to Philippians.
我哋去打開腓立比書。
And Philippians chapter 2.
腓立比書第2章。
Let's read verse 3 to verse 4.
我哋睇第3到第4節。
That's Philippians chapter 2,
腓立比書第2章
verse 3 to verse 4.
第3到第4節。
Verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others.
第3節，凡事不可結黨，不可貪圖虛浮的榮耀，只要全心謙卑，各人看別人比自己強，各人不要單顧自己的事，也要顧別人的事。
So here Apostle Paul teaches us in verse 4 that we need to think about the interests of other people.
呢個保羅就講到，我哋係要諗去顧別人嘅事。
So it can be maybe matters or issues that are important or affecting that other person.
咁可能係一啲困難或者一啲事情係對其他人嚟講係好重要嘅。
But it can also be thinking about things which might be beneficial and helpful to other people.
或者係諗一啲事情可以對別人有好處。
It doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about yourself.
咁當然唔係話你唔應該諗自己，
But that you shouldn't only just think about yourself.
但係你唔應該只係諗自己。
And in verse 3, he teaches us that when we do help others,
喺第3節都教到我哋，當我哋去幫助人嘅時候，
that Paul says that it shouldn't be done through selfish ambition or conceit.
咁保羅就話我哋唔係為咗自己嘅榮耀。
So we're not helping because we're seeking some sort of personal gain,
咁我哋去幫助唔係因為我哋想得到啲乜嘢，
or for any personal glory or praise from others.
或者係為咗自己嘅榮耀想得到別人嘅讚美。
We help out of a genuine concern for them,
我哋係真係去關心佢哋，
that we're thinking about what is good and beneficial for them.
我哋係真係去諗有啲乜嘢係對佢哋有好處。
I think with the rise of social media,
咁喺個社交媒體嘅發展，
there's also a rise of people who post like pictures and videos to try to show like some positive image of themselves.
咁其實就係人去發布一啲影片、相片，去話俾人知自己係有幾好。
Like I don't know the percentage, but we do know that some of these are just set up to show something which doesn't actually reflect the real life of that person.
咁我唔知道個百分比，但係其實我哋都知道有啲人佢哋所發布嘅其實唔係佢哋真實嘅生活。
No, those purposes for those like set up pictures are just to get maybe more likes, more follows from other people.
咁嗰啲相其實只係想獲得更多嘅讚好，更多人去跟隨佢哋。
So this aspect of human nature is of course not new and not caused specifically by social media.
咁呢一個人嘅本性其實當然唔係新㗎啦，亦都唔係因為社交媒體嘅興起而有。
But it's also a reminder that we do need to be aware of and to examine our own motives for helping people.
咁但係我哋亦都係去 令到我哋自己去思考，究竟我哋幫助人哋嘅動機係乜嘢呢？
Because there is a human nature where we enjoy being looked up to and being praised by others.
咁我哋嘅人嘅本性其實係想俾人去睇好，想俾人去讚美。
So we need to be aware of ourselves that we do not do good deeds for the purpose of showing to other people.
咁我哋就要去提醒自己，當我哋去做好事嘅時候，唔係因為咗去別人讚美。
Let's turn to Acts chapter 20.
咁我哋去打開《使徒行傳》嘅第20章，
Let's read verse 33 to verse 35.
我哋睇33至35節，《
Acts chapter 20,
使徒行傳》20章
verse 33 to verse 35.
33到35節。
Verse 33. I have coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. Yes, you yourselves know that these hands have provided for my necessities and for those who are with me. I have shown you in every way by laboring like this that you must support the weak. Remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive.
33節，我未曾貪圖一個人的金銀衣服，我這兩隻手常供給我和同人的需用，這是你們自己知道的。我凡事給你們作榜樣，叫你們知道應當這樣勞苦，扶助軟弱的人，又當紀念主耶穌的話說：施比受更為有福。
So this speech by Paul is given in Ephesus.
咁呢一個保羅所講嘅係喺呢一個以弗所講。
It is on his way back to Jerusalem where he would go on to be arrested.
咁就係佢去翻去耶路撒冷嘅路程，佢係會俾人捉。
So in verse 35 we see a similar encouragement to what we learn from Jesus, that the members must support the weak.
咁呢度其實35節所教訓嘅同耶穌所講嘅一樣，就係門徒要去幫助呢啲軟弱嘅人，
Also to have compassion on other people and to help them.
去憐恤佢哋，去幫助佢哋。
Paul in his ministry has given example to the other members on how to support the weak.
咁喺保羅嘅侍奉當中，佢就係去做一個好榜樣，去點樣去幫助軟弱嘅人。
And he both lived out and kept the teachings that he himself wrote that we read in Philippians.
咁喺呢一個腓立比書佢所寫嘅教訓，佢自己都有去行出嚟。
Because even though he was both an apostle and a minister,
咁當然佢係一個門徒，亦都係一個侍奉嘅工人。
Paul still worked to earn money to provide for both himself and his fellow co-workers.
咁但係其實保羅佢自己都係有工作去賺錢，去令到自己同埋佢嘅工人可以有飽足。
So this shows us how he was thinking of others in his service,
咁當佢去服侍嘅時候，其實佢係有諗到別人，
or how he's thinking about the impact on others.
咁就係去諗到對人嘅影響。
Firstly, that he does not want to take away money, clothes, like possessions from other people to support his work.
咁佢就係唔想喺人嘅身上攞走佢哋嘅金銀衣服，去為咗去供給自己。
Meaning also to take away from the very people that he's also trying to help.
就係話喺佢要幫助嘅人身上去攞嘢。
But we see that he's also thinking about what example that he is setting and leaving behind for fellow workers and future workers.
咁但係佢亦都係同時間諗到佢係作為佢而家嘅工人，亦都係將來嘅工人嘅榜樣。
So Paul is willing to humble himself.
咁保羅願意去謙卑自己，
Also to sacrifice himself by having to work, for example, that extra job.
咁就係去犧牲自己，佢哋去做額外嘅工作，
In addition to his ministry,
就係喺佢嘅傳道嘅工作之外，
all with the interests and benefits of others in his mind.
就係為咗佢嘅工人去得到好處。
So let's turn to Matthew chapter 20.
我哋去打開馬太福音嘅20章，
Let's read verse 26 to verse 28.
我哋睇26到28節。
It's Matthew chapter 20,
馬太福音20章
verse 26 to verse 28.
26到28節。
Verse 26.
26節，
But it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
26節，只是你們中間不可這樣，你們中間誰願為大，就必作你們的用人；誰願為首，就必作你們的僕人。正如人子來，不是要受人的服侍，乃是要服侍人，並且要捨命作多人的贖價。
So this is like the next stage or level up.
咁呢個就係下一個部分，亦都係一個更加深嘅層次。
So in verse 20, since this is Jesus' own words,
呢個係耶穌自己所講嘅説話。
in verse 28, we see that Jesus understood the purpose of his life.
咁耶穌就係喺28節講到佢明白自己生命嘅意義。
That firstly, that he came to serve, not to be served by others.
咁首先就係佢係嚟服侍人，唔係受人嘅服侍。
That he is here to take on the role of a servant.
咁佢就係做呢一個僕人嘅角色。
So that's why when he saw the multitude,
咁我哋點解佢要去服侍呢個百姓？
he could not turn them away, but instead help them.
佢唔去轉離佢哋，而係去幫助佢哋。
Well, despite their own, you say like personal issues for Jesus and the disciples at that time.
雖然耶穌同埋門徒佢哋本身佢哋自己都有佢哋嘅需要，
Such as being tired and hungry,
就係佢哋要休息，佢哋好肚餓。
or for Jesus wanting to mourn.
就係呢一個耶穌想去紀念呢個施洗約翰。
For a good servant should put the needs and interests of his master first above his own.
咁但係呢一個好嘅僕人係要將佢嘅主人嘅吩咐擺喺自己嘅需要以先。
I think this should be very logical and sensible.
咁呢一個係非常之容易去明白。
If a servant decides not to follow order because he has to do his own house chores, for example,
咁作為一個工人，冇理由話因為我哋唔聽主人講啦，因為我要自己做自己屋企嘅事。
then of course that could not possibly be a good servant.
咁呢個就唔會係一個好嘅僕人。
So see that Jesus first helped the multitude,
咁我哋可以見到耶穌首先去幫助呢個會眾，
and then only afterwards he went to pray alone by himself.
咁就係佢哋侍奉咗會眾之後，佢哋耶穌先去獨自去禱告。
His life purpose was about sacrificing himself for the benefit and good of others.
咁佢嘅生命嘅意義就係要犧牲自己去為咗別人嘅好處。
So ultimately concluding in Jesus literally sacrificing his life for us.
咁最終耶穌係真係去為我哋去捨命。
This is a stage and example that we should ultimately be aiming for.
呢個就係一個過程，一個嘅榜樣，我哋需要去學習。
So not just to have care and concern and to help others,
唔係淨係只係關顧去幫助，
but to be even to willing to sacrifice ourselves to help others.
甚至係願意犧牲自己去幫助別人，
So where we put others above ourselves.
就係將別人去擺喺比我哋以先。
So Brother Nicholas in his sermon earlier
咁 Nicholas 已經啱啱嘅分享，
also ended with some like practical examples on how we can sacrifice ourselves to help others.
咁亦都有實際嘅例子，就係我哋點樣去犧牲自己去幫助別人。
But in general, where we have something where it could be example money, possessions,
咁可能係金錢上，
or the knowledge that we have,
或者係我哋有嘅知識，
or even just that we have time.
或者係我哋嘅時間。
But we should be able to find ways in which we can sacrifice ourselves to help others,
咁我哋就可以揾到一啲方法去犧牲自己幫助別人。
or to help those other people who are in need with what we do have.
咁就係去幫助別人，係我哋有嘅嘢去幫助別人。
Let's turn to John chapter 13.
我哋去打開約翰福音13章。
Let's read verse 34 to verse 35.
睇34到35節。
John chapter 13,
約翰福音13章
verse 34 to verse 35.
34到35節。
Verse 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
34節，我賜給你們一條新命令，乃是叫你們彼此相愛。我怎樣愛你們，你們也要怎樣相愛。你們若有彼此相愛的心，眾人因此就認出你們是我的門徒了。
So as Christians, our goal should really be to aim to be like Jesus.
我哋作為基督徒嘅目標係應該要好似耶穌一樣。
It's of course not something that can just happen overnight.
咁當然唔係一夜之間會發生。
And I think obviously it's not a simple goal to both have or to reach.
亦都唔係一個話簡單去達到嘅目標。
But hopefully through a deeper understanding behind the miracle of feeding the 5,000.
咁但係希望透過我哋有更深嘅明白呢一個餵飽5000人嘅神蹟，
We can also deepen our understanding of Jesus and ultimately God's compassion for us,
咁我哋就可以去明白耶穌，明白神對我哋嘅憐恤。
which his compassion is also a big part of God's love for us.
佢嘅憐憫就係神嘅愛。
We can understand how we need to improve ourselves
我哋可以明白點樣去改善自己，
and what we need to be able to continue our pursuit of fulfilling Jesus' commandment here,
咁就係我哋點樣去改善自己，令我哋去繼續追求神嘅吩咐，
which is to love others as he loved us.
就係去愛人如同佢愛我哋一樣。
So we need to learn to have the same mindset as Jesus,
我哋要有同耶穌一樣嘅心智，
to really be able to sympathize and have compassion for others,
就係去憐恤同明白人哋，
and to learn to think about others,
去諗別人，
and ultimately to learn to be able to sacrifice ourselves in helping others.
最終就係去犧牲自己去幫助別人。
Okay, may all glory be unto God.
願一切嘅榮耀歸俾神。
My sharing on this topic
今日
is.
嘅分享到呢度，
Okay, let's conclude by rising up to sing hymn 244.
一齊起立唱詩244。